Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Lightbulb Café. This year, Penn Arts and Sciences has rebranded their Lightbulb Café series into a virtual book group so that audiences near and far can hear from our wonderful faculty authors about their work and what inspires them. I'd like to note that this series is generously funded by the Adolph and Felicia Leon Fund, which supports Penn Arts and Sciences, lecture series, and programming. I'm Karen McCloskey. I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture at Weitzman School of Design, and I'm really excited to be speaking today with Jared Farmer, the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History. Jared studies histories of built and unbuilt environments from the hyperlocal to the planet-wide. He's received numerous accolades for his work, including from institutions such as the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Humanities Center, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Jared has written many scholarly essays and reviews, as well as pieces in the New York Times, Smithsonian, and on the BBC. His book, On Zion's Mount, Mormons, Indians, and the American Landscape, received the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians. And today we'll be discussing his most recent book, Elderflora, A Modern History of Ancient Trees. In it, Jared surveys the complex history of the world's oldest trees, including indigenous voices, religious figures, and contemporary scientists who study elderflora in crisis. And this won the Jacques Barzun Prize from the American Philosophical Society. After our discussion, we'll have time to answer some of the questions that were previously submitted from our audience members. But first, welcome, Jared, and we're going to begin with an excerpt from your book.
Okay. Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you, all of you who have come here today. And hello, everybody online, Penn alumni and friends. And it's great to be with you. And thanks for your interest in my book. Yeah, so here it is. It's beautiful. This is actually the UK edition, which I think is slightly more beautiful than the US one, but they're both very nice. So I'll read you a short excerpt from the introduction. Ancient trees are more than service providers. They are ethical gift givers. They invite us to be fully human, truly sapient, by engaging our deepest faculties to venerate, to analyze, to meditate. They expand our moral and temporal imaginations. This end-all argument, at once pragmatic and philosophical, is a matter of time. Big time is the age of the universe, well over 10 billion years, a cosmic narrative that begins with the Big Bang and ends with endless entropy, or something more mysterious. This timescale is arcane, the Einsteinian realm of cosmology. Deep time is the age of the Earth, beyond 4 billion years, a linear story, a geohistory visualized vertically, layers upon layers, a stratigraphy of time. The geological timescale was the great collaborative project of science in the 18th and 19th centuries. Long time is more than a human lifetime, even counting the doubling of life expectancies in the recent past. It exceeds the span between deceased grandparents and unborn grandchildren. At the upper limit, it's equivalent to the current geological epoch, the Holocene, the past 11 millennia when ice retreated and humans proliferated. This temporality is predictive as well as historical, covering the planetary future of humans as well as the human past. It's the timescale of intergenerational ethics and Earth system modeling, a key collaborative project of science in the current moment. Short time is the scale of business cycles and news cycles, the user periods of disposable products, the half-lives of fads and online memes, durations of several years, a few financial quarters, or mere days. Even long-term shareholder value runs quite short. The shortening of popular culture is a signal accomplishment of consumer capitalism and now surveillance capitalism in tandem with Americanization. Of these temporalities, only big time seems self-contained anymore. The other three collapse into each other or melt. The deep, the long, and the short dissolve into one time frame, the Anthropocene. The historical becomes the geological, and the present becomes the future when we fathom the human impact on the carbon cycle. Climate change is time changed. Short-term decisions made or postponed may linger for millennia. Throwaway choices in the aggregate may have permanent evolutionary consequences. Over million-year cycles, rocks will record modernity in technofossils as well as fossil absences that mark extinctions. With geological power comes epical responsibility, the duty of long-term thinking. This is the problem of our time, a problem of time, even as attention spans get shorter and shorter.
Thank you. This book is so beautifully written. Following on what you just read, you've also stated that the survival of the oldest requires continuity of stories passed down of veneration and violation, and that, quote, stories, like trees, are among the most enduring things in creation. So what prompted you to write this story of Elderflora?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is a kind of a heavy book, even though it's meant to be a hopeful book. I mean, I started this, I want to say, it took me about 10 years, so it would have been sometime in the Obama years, and I foolishly allowed myself a sense of optimism about the future of everything. And at some point, this book, I finished it during COVID somehow. I don't even remember how I did, honestly. And the best I could do was to hope for an anti-hopeless book. But I do think trees are anti-hopeless, right? Because trees are a thing, a being, a kind of life form on this planet that long precedes us, by orders of magnitude, going back hundreds of millions of years, into planets that we can barely even connect to intellectually. I mean, they're on Earth, but very different planets. But trees have been there through hot and cold and icy and ice-free. And as long as there have been humans, going back, about 1 million years or more, they have affiliated with trees. They've cared about trees, venerated trees, told stories about trees. So there's a way that our relationships with trees help bridge that gap between, the short and the deep. Because deep time, geologic time, I mean, it's beautiful, and it's kind of like mathematics. It's beautiful, but it's abstract, it's remote, it's intellectual. It's something you think about. You don't feel geologic time. People go to the Grand Canyon to feel it, but it's pretty hard even in the Grand Canyon. You feel other things, but maybe you don't feel deep time. But you can feel long time through a tree. A tree is alive. A tree is something you can care about emotionally. You can relate to it. But also you can relate to fellow humans in the past who also cared for this same tree or trees like it. So there's this kind of continuity. So that's one reason I chose trees. Basically, I wanted to write a book about the most important topic in the world, which I think is climate change. But then I wanted, to write about long-term thinking, which seemed to be one of the key problems within the problem of climate change. And I thought, trees can kind of get me there, and it's a fun way to kind of organize a book through trees, and allows me to talk about the planet without doing planetary history, which is impossible for any one person. But there's a way that by choosing select trees around the world, you can kind of get the best of both worlds, something that's very local, very particular, but also gets at really big themes.
Yeah. So I love that, the anti-hopeless message of your book. I agree with that. I love this book. And what you just said reminds me of your description of living trees as bridges between past, present, and future. But you have commented that humans have a great ability to think about our deep past, but we're not so great about thinking of our long-term future. And so trees, in many ways, help us.
Well, I'm a historian. Historians, all we do professionally is think about the past, right? We think about dead people and our connections to them and our obligation to them, but also the gifts and also the legacies, sometimes very negative and ugly legacies they bequeath to us. And then we think about, by writing history, what we are bequeathing to the future. I mean, historians are always thinking in these multiple temporalities. But we don't think about the future, right? And historians will say, that's not what we do. And in fact, historians are terrible. They have a terrible track record of predicting the future. And it is striking, right, that when you think of people who make predictions about the future, prophets, futurists, futurologists, tech billionaires, I don't know, their visions often scare me. At least I'm just speaking personally now. but also these visions always seem very much about the moment. And I just think that we have this whole practice, and you can think of like going to the cemetery, celebrating a Day of the Dead, doing any form of ancestry worship or ancestry appreciation through a religious practice or a secular practice, doing genealogy, just appreciating the layers of human history, going to an ancient city, like Mexico City or Rome or wherever. There's all these ways we are constantly referencing the deep human past, right? And we care so much about the dead, which is beautiful. That's one of the things that makes us human. But can we think so clearly about people in the future without just it becoming these vague, future generations? I don't really know the answer, but it just seems to me that when we are changing the climate of not just for trees but for humans far into the future, we've already done it, right? We've already bequeathed a different climate to people in the future. We need to be thinking very carefully about who those people are and how they can have a sense of continuity with us, and not one that's just about resentment, and also not one that's a rupture, because I think that's the thing that maybe we're all afraid of, is that there would be some sort of temporal abyss where like things get so bad that the people in the future, they don't know about us and they don't care about us because things got so bad that the continuity stops. And the continuity, I think, is like one of the key themes of this story. It's about keeping not just old life forms alive, but more about keeping relationships, because relationships are much more like stories, and stories are relationships, right? Because you have to tell you and you tell somebody else. It's a community, and it's keeping relationships alive. That's important because things die, right? People die, trees die, and that's okay. But these stories about old trees, again, are like enduring stories about enduring life forms, are among the most enduring things. So that's just kind of like a metaphor for all the different ways we need to be cultivating a practice of long-term thinking that is partly intellectual, but I want to say it's going to be partly about practice, about the built environment, about ritual maybe, both religious and maybe secular ritual. I think this is something we all need to be thinking about. Yeah.
Well, the excerpt you read describes a number of different temporalities that you just referenced: short-term, long-term, deep time, long time. And one statement that really jumped out at me in your introduction, which I feel like I should have thought about before but didn't until I read it, was that of the 5 major extinction events in Earth's history, they're primarily defined in terms of animal extinction, not plant extinction.
Yes.
And so it's easy to forget, or that suppresses the fact that we have species that have been with us for 150 million years.
Right.
So what is the climate message of your book in that regard?
Well, again, I suppose, again, it's semi-hopeful or anti-hopeless in the sense that if you think through plants, there was so much time left on this planet. Or I like to think of it this way, like, Earth has many potential planets in it, and there have been many planets on Earth already, and there'll be many planets to come before Earth is no more. But that's so far in the future. And plants have already lived through so many planets, one place, one plant at a time. And there's something very inspiring about that kind of resilience, where I invented this word like perdurance to describe resilience over time. So yes, the geologic timescale, it's this incredible achievement of science in the 18th and 19th century. And if you think about those layers from like your geology class, like those hard boundaries, those are often extinction events, and sometimes you can mark them by the absence of fossils, like they suddenly just disappear, because animal fossils tend to preserve better than plant fossils. So there's a certain prejudice for animals built into stratigraphy. Plant tissue can survive, but you have to look harder. So there is a way that there's a zoocentrism, kind of an animal focus built into geologic time. So for example, the Mesozoic period, we're in the Cenozoic now, it's like the animal time, essentially. And I'd like to think of it as the coniferous instead, because, conifers, which are some of the oldest kinds of woody plants, they are much older than dinosaurs, and all of the conifers today survived the KT extinction event. And And many of these are familiar, beloved plants. I mean, ginkgo is a famous example. So yes, I mean, they have been losing out evolutionarily to other plants in the last, 100 million years, but like their twilight is so long. To me, there's something inspiring about that. Like, yes, all things must end, all things must die, but like to kind of, to persist in precarity, right? To be, to show perdurance, to kind of have a sense, a practice of resilience over a long time. I think we can learn a lot from trees, even though, of course, we're not like trees. We wish we were in a sense because, like, they're totally solar powered. They're totally vegetarian, right? I mean, like, they're actually perfectly adapted to long-term living on Earth. Of course, the trade-off is like they can't move, and we have a very different evolutionary strategy. We move everywhere.
Well, you've invented a number of new terms for your book, so elderflora being one of them, and one that I find particularly compelling is chronodiversity. And so we just talked about that deep, long history, but tell us about why you needed new terms and then what you mean by chronodiversity.
I think it started with elderflora because I think I just got tired of writing old trees, ancient trees over and over again. I mean, tree is like an old English word. It's a powerful word, but I don't think it's a beautiful word necessarily, tree. And also I just thought about how many times the word tree would show up in the book. But also the more I got into the research, I realized that not every plant, and certainly not every being that can live a long, long time do we recognize as a tree. And at some point I realized that a tree is just a plant we call a tree. It's not a botanical, scientific term. I think it's a term of dignity, right? It's plants that we dignify in a certain way as honorary persons. I mean, it's a personification fallacy, but it's a deep cultural one, and actually sort of honor the deep history of that personification fallacy. But then I wanted to kind of enlarge that realm of dignity, or that realm of ethical regard for all the other old, like long-lasting plants, some which are shrubby, some which are clonal, some growers rather than individual single trunks, some of which don't look like trees, may not have wood. There's lots and lots of different plant forms that are long-lasting. So elderflora to me is a wider term, but also one that suggests that kind of dignity that gets to the realm of reverence, because this book does have a lot of religion in it. And again, this deep cross-cultural kind of spiritual regard for long-lived plants is a very impressive general feature of humankind. And I think tree didn't quite capture that. Anyway, so that's why I chose elderflora. But then once I chose that, it's like, why don't I just keep going? I'm just gonna invent more words. And that's partly because, climate change is making the world weird, right? In a way that all of us feel a bit destabilized. Like, is it supposed to be like this? I don't remember the world being like this when I was a kid. Things we took for granted. Maybe we expect technology to change all the time, but I don't remember, a winter in Philadelphia where it never snowed, because it has never been recorded, in fact, right? So a new vocabulary to kind of express the instability of the novel times in which we live, right? So I came up with 20 or 30 words in the end. And it's okay if they don't all stick, but it became kind of like an exercise. So chronodiversity is one that I hope actually does stick.
I think it will.
Because it might have usefulness to scientists. Scientists like to measure everything, right? And define very carefully and count. And so biodiversity, which is the kind of complement, means like species richness. So it's like how many species, as sort of defined by scientists, exist in a given area, right? So it's a kind of density of species in a given area, and you can count that and measure it, and you can talk about how it's increasing or decreasing, or how some places are hotspots of. Chronodiversity is a complement. I mean, you could count it, right? But first you'd have to define it. I would define it as like the existence in a given area of species, but also individuals and also populations of different ages, So some species are very, very old, right? Some are relatively young in terms of evolution. You have an old tree, you might have an old population. So there's lots of different ways that like you could have old components within a community, within an ecosystem. And the idea is that the more diversity, the more possibility for life, and that often old species and old individuals and old populations are providing these very important ecosystem functions. So it is a complement of biodiversity health. So that's one way scientists might pick it up, but I have like a broader, more cultural meaning. So for me, chronodiversity would also be, again, the way that trees, ancient trees, elderflora, help us feel long time, or even the edges of deep time emotionally, right? So that when we walk around in our daily lives, we're not just living, in the moment and the short-term future and the short-term past, which is how most of us operate, but on a daily basis, a tree can pull us back to a different geological period. And that's chronodiversity. Another chronodiversity would be like all the different cultures in the world who have different ideas and relationships with trees, and those cultures are of different ages. Right? And that's part of the beauty of humankind, right? And there's different calendar systems, right? The one we use, right? 2023 is one of many out there. And so to be fully aware of the chronodiversity in the human experience, but also in our relationship with trees who themselves embody or represent these more scientific kinds of multi-temporalities. That was getting at it. The more I thought about trees, they really did kind of blow my mind, because like trees, again, they don't even like live or die like us. I mean, they don't even definitively have to die, and it's more like they just keep dying until they no longer can die, and that's how they live. And it's just a very different way of thinking about existence in time and place. And of course, trees, they're completely rooted, they're completely committed to place, they're as local as can be. But then if you think of tree seeds and tree pollen, trees are everywhere all the time in all levels of the atmosphere. So in a sense, they're way more mobile than we'll ever be. And so I think to me, trees are kind of deeply alien as well as deeply terrestrial, and they're unlike us, but then we relate to them emotionally unlike any other plants. So they really are special. It's a long-winded way of saying, I think trees were worthy of this kind of vocabulary exercise, and at some point it did be. And on my website, I have this like whole lexicon, because I didn't actually in the book define any of these terms, because I wanted readers to kind of just have kind of immersion experience. It is like somewhat challenging read, and it's a slow read, and I think that's okay, because these are slow plants. This is not a book that's meant to be read at one reading, right? I think it's again, like I'm very serious about how trees engage these faculties, which we I think are atrophying to some degree, because we are, we're all doing this all the time, need to. And it's good sometimes. I think, if I were to give advice to maybe myself, if I were reading this book, it's like, put the device away and like read it slowly in pieces, and it's that kind of book.
I hope chronodiversity takes off. I just love your phrases and how they interweave the scientific definition with the much longer cultural history, and I think chronodiversity does that really well. But it also reminds me about, you were referring to the trees being protected, say the giant sequoias in California, and that they're protecting the eldest trees, but you also commented on scientists who are saying that we also need to be caring about the saplings, so because those are going to be the future elder trees. So the importance of protecting not just the thing that we can numerically call the oldest.
Because you can definitely fetishize the oldest tree.
Yeah. How do we know something is the oldest living thing, and when did people start that as a scientific quest? So
so this kind of fetishization of like things you can count and measure and tabulate. I mean, that's very modern, right? So it won't surprise you this started in the 18th century. I mean, people have been wondering about how old trees can be for as long as people have been making records that have passed down to us. And, Pliny the Elder, who wrote, natural history long ago, had a list of oldest trees, but he used a very different, pre or proto-scientific way of thinking of age. It was more relational. So this tree is as old as the city or as old as the temple. And if that tree died, and again, trees die, the priests or the caretakers, the wardens, they could replant a tree of the same kind in the same place, and it's effectively the same tree, right? So it's more about the built environment, how the tree is an integral part of the city or the temple within the city, and again, it's about the tradition. But you fast forward to the modern period, the 18th century, and then now you have these people who we now call scientists. That's a 19th century word, kind of describing this kind of point of view. There are out there these things, discrete things, and we must find them, discover them, name them, claim them, core them, date them. I mean, there's something kind of, disturbing about this whole project, even though, of course, science has brought us so many wonderful things. There's a certain disquiet, I hope comes out in this book about this whole process. I suppose one good thing is we now know that there are old things everywhere, right? And so there's certain, you could say, a democratization of appreciation for old trees, because anywhere where you need an increment borer, right? There's a couple techniques. I mean, or three main ones. You can use an increment borer. This is something German foresters invented in the 19th century. It's like a crank. It's more technical than that, but you extract a core sample, and as long as you did it right, you can count all the way back. There's also, in the 20th century, radiocarbon dating, which can give you estimated dates if you have the right wood. Or you can guesstimate using a girth to age formula, and some of those formula are good. But this book, in a sense, its structure, its narrative structure is based on the scientific quest to find the oldest tree in the world, which ends up being much more about the core cranking. You can relate this to ice cores, right, or lake bed cores. There's a way that scientists, especially climate scientists, become obsessed with what you can learn from annual layers of different kinds. So this new science, dendrochronology, tree ring science, is codified in the early 20th century in Arizona. So I sort of follow tree ring scientists. And so from their point of view, right, there is an answer to this. What is the oldest tree in the world? And it's what you would find if you Google it, right? But you have to just keep in mind that what that really means is the oldest known tree, right? So there's lots of things we cannot know scientifically, right? Because tree ring scientists don't estimate. They either have a year or they don't have a year. They have a date, they don't have a date. And something's a tree or it's not a tree, and a tree must have wood. And so actually it's a fairly limited, the science sort of necessitated a certain type of plant. And so you could say, in the sense, dendrochronology produced ancient trees to our knowledge. And again, that means that so many people can now visit ancient trees, which is wonderful. But my book is kind of come full circle, saying that we need to maybe go back more to the Pliny or the pre-modern, it's not just about Pliny, view of relational age, that we've already changed the climate so much. The new COP summit is going to start in Dubai, and that tells you all you need to know about the progress we're making relative to what we need to make. So the climate that all of the oldest trees in the world was born in is obsolete, it's gone, and they will all die prematurely. They won't all die at once, but so really it's about, what are the future oldest trees? Where are they? Are we planting them? Are we caring for them? Are we creating a political world as well as a climate that will sustain old things in the future, even though they might not reach the maximum age of trees in the Holocene, which was just a really good time to be an old tree, it turns out. But if you think about relational age, it's more okay, can we plant trees now that can withstand this new climate that we've created, that will be more variable, that will be hotter, but also just be more intense, right? Drier droughts, hotter heat waves, more extreme, more weird. sort of thinking about the trees that can be perdurable in those circumstances. So if you look at a place like Penn campus, like College Green, I work in College Hall, like they have planted trees for the future. I mean, they've obviously the people on campus, the arborists, have thought about these beautiful elms, including a scion of the so-called Penn treaty tree. Like it will die eventually, and maybe prematurely, but they planted new trees, and 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and there's a kind of sense that to keep this going, you have to be thinking ahead, and that's just a microcosm of what we need to be doing all over the world, and not just with trees. It has to do with building cities and making cities more resilient, and as there's going to be so many climate refugees or just different ways of living in cities in the future. So this challenge of creating an urban forest that is as old as the city, or to create a future oldest tree that is as whose measure of oldest is not did it reach 1,000 years according to science, but did it persist with humans living in place as long as it needed to. I mean, to me, that's the much more appropriate kind of expression of longevity, which is a much earlier one.
Well, that relates to what you describe throughout your book as, you call it placeways, which are things that contribute to a plant's longevity beyond its natural ability for living a long life. And so what are some of those placeways, or where might we find the oldest living trees?
Yeah. So that's sort of playing on pathways. So a place, because trees are committed to place. So the placeways for trees to reach their maximum potential on Earth. I mean, it's just to simplify. There's two. It's basically, if you're a tree, you want, not the trees want necessarily, but I'm personifying. You want to be as close as possible to people, as close as possible, right on College Green, right next to the president's office, in the temple compound. Right, you want to be in the heart of the city. You want to be in the shrine, right, at the man or whatever. Or you want to be as far away from people, because people are the apex predators of trees. Humans are great, protectors of trees, but they're great destroyers too. Vandals, but also just users, wasters, destroyers, right, of trees. And so that's where you find the oldest trees in the world, to generalize. You find them in ancient cities, in ancient spaces where people have kind of kept these traditions of caretaking alive, or you find them in swamps, in badlands, in lava fields. You find them on steep, arid, remote desert mountains, or places where people do not frequent, where just trees have managed to find a little habitat that's just good enough and kind of cling, because trees are just great if they can get established at just barely growing, sometimes not growing at all, just just being long term and with no competition basically, and that's where you find the trees. And so the oldest tree in the world, if you look at the list, they're the Great Basin bristlecone pine, who live in an extremely austere environment in Eastern California, Nevada, Western Utah. And to get back to your question though about science, so science says produced all of these ancient trees, but this is a non-renewable resource, because once they die, they're dead. Yeah. Right. But if you think about relational age, that's a renewable resource. The oldest tree at Penn, that's a renewable resource, as long as there is a Penn, right? As long as there's a Penn in Philadelphia, as long as there are trees there will be an oldest tree at Penn. And it doesn't really matter which one necessarily, because it's more about the tradition, right? Keeping the place alive. And I think that's the kind of thinking I want to get back to, even as I sort of love the story of tree science. And you can do amazing things with tree science, and they've learned so much about, dating supervolcanic eruptions and dating stellar proton events and creating, these climate chronologies, drought cycles. I mean, it's just incredible, the data you can extract. But a part of me kind of wants to resist sort of thinking about ancient trees as like scientific utilitarian instruments that will die and then they're dead, right? Like
you described in your book tracking down the 25 slices of the giant sequoia that exist in different museums and noting how time was measured through them, like to the Crusades or to the Declaration of Independence, and it's all these cultural events are marked on the tree rings, but then now you're saying more events are being added and that have to do more with climate or volcanoes or fires. There's a lot we can learn from tree rings beyond just counting the years. So.
Yes.
Yeah. So you did say what the oldest tree is in the world, at bristlecone pine. How many people know where this oldest tree is?
I would say probably scores of people, tree ring scientists, a few forest rangers. But again, that's the oldest known tree with a name. There's another one without a name that actually is known to be older. But then there's all these other great bristlecone pines whose age cannot be known. And it is known that great bristlecone pines are the outlier species. So surely like the oldest unknowable tree in the world, the way that most people define tree, which is like a single-trunked woody plant, but that's not the only way to define what a tree is, but is surely a Great Basin bristlecone pine, but it's not one that has a name. It's not one that's been cored. It's in some other place where the desert winds have bladed away the oldest ring, so it's actually undatable. So at some level, it doesn't matter. And just in case people are interested, you can Google. There's an amazing species in Patagonia, Alerce, Fitzroya patagonica, and there's a particular plant in a national park in Chile that people are suggesting might be older than the oldest bristlecone, but that's based on one of these formulas, like a very complicated formula, because like they can't get a full tree ring record. But certainly like a Alerce can live up to 4,000 years. Tragically, most of them were cleared and burned during the 19th century by kind of colonial settlers and officials. So that there's a whole kind of very melancholy chapter in the book about this kind of pan-Pacific period of kind of big tree exploitation when some of like the oldest, biggest trees in the world were reduced to ashes in a very short period of time, but then out of the ashes, kind of national park movements were born.
Are scientists still trying to find the oldest living tree, or is that
They're
a
not
quest
really,
that's
because
more
again, I mean,
from the past?
this book sort of like, in a sense, like loses its narrative momentum near the end. I mean, that's on purpose, because the oldest tree in the world was announced by National Geographic in 1958. The guy who discovered it, died of a stroke like the day the magazine went to press, which is, and he was at the bursar's office at the university, which I mean, as a fellow professor, like what a sad into like a academic life that is. But like that was sort of the end. Then there was a grand kind of Humboldtian, Alexander von Humboldt, the great swashbuckling, world-famous naturalist scientist of the 19th century, was part of this effort to find the oldest tree. Once you get to the mid-20th century, I think scientists have moved on to other things, but also they just didn't need to get any more data from old trees. They created these amazing archives, and there's a way then you can connect one old tree to another old tree through samples, and so finding one that's marginally older than another one, it doesn't matter anymore. So it kind of loses steam. And that's just as well, because again, this is a very, I would say, European, colonial, and very, I would say, masculine kind of like quest to find the oldest things. And there's something a little silly about it at some point, even though like there are amazing plants that were made known through this process. But I was sort of relieved actually to kind of like get to that part of the book, like 2/3 the way through, and say, okay, we found the oldest thing in the world, but oldest tree in the world, but what is a tree anyway?
Yeah.
And then what if we enlarge our definition of a tree? What if we stop caring about that one way of defining tree and that one way of measuring tree. Where can we go now?
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the last part of the book sort of takes a different turn, I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and bristlecone pines, for those who may not know what it looks like, it's not majestic like the sequoias you talk about. It's more shriveled and dry, and it's a harsh landscape. And I remember you saying in the book how, it went from people just thought it was kind of trash and used it for building fences, and then very, soon after, there's a kind of reverence and protection, Great Basin National Park. So that kind of change.
Because sequoia longevity was discovered, I guess you would say, because Americans cut them down, right? You could count all the rings in the late 19th century. And then people said okay, that's it. Of course, this is the oldest tree in the world because it's the biggest plant in the world, because there was that kind of sense that biggest must mean oldest. And then a lot of Americans were in love with this idea that, like this quest will end in Western America. And of course, it's in America that the biggest, oldest trees. And they're big and straight, and everybody agrees that they're just awesome, right?
Yeah.
And bristlecones are everything sequoia is not, right? Mm-hmm. But you're right, there's this incredible transformation in like a 10-year period from this like good-for-nothing tree to like this object of scientific curiosity, but very quickly scientific reverence. And you have Edmund Schulman, the tree ring scientist who discovered bristlecone longevity, had an assistant, and he took over the project, the tree ring lab project. And he wrote in Science magazine about pilgrimage in the 1960s, saying that like very quickly, like not just like the tourists who would come, but then the scientists themselves began to kind of think of these trees as like semi-sacred. And so this language of like sacred sites, pilgrimage, starts creeping in. Not just creeping, it just like it cycles back very quickly. And I just found that fascinating. And again, this is kind of recapitulation of like history of religion comes back into history of science. And I do think of these bristlecones now as de facto sacred trees in a de facto sacred grove. That's how people and so they're not that different than sequoias, but there was a huge kind of change that occurred. And I think I find that kind of hopeful in a way. It kind of shows how people's like aesthetic response can be modified, and how people can, again, go to deep cultural stories and traditions to kind of give new meaning to trees. The fact that this is called a grove even, which is like a word that has all these like associations with the Greek and Roman worlds, I kind of like that sense of cultural continuity. And I think the aesthetics, the fact that people now can appreciate these trees, which are, again, if you've never seen them, you can just like, here's a kind of picture. They're very, when they grow up at, 10 to 12,000 feet, they're growing like that much a year.
Yeah.
And they take these gnarled, twisty, deformed or wraith-like. There's all these like terms people use in the mid-20th century. Like they're like, goblins or wraiths or ghouls or witches, whatever. But they're very sculptural, but they're stunted to the extreme, and they're contorted to the extreme. They're not very tall. They don't fit any of those kind of. If you ask a tree to draw, ask a kid draw a tree, it does not
look like.
Or if you like ask, generative AI, like draw a beautiful tree, it would not produce. But people now think of them as beautiful, and I think that's because it encourages beautiful thinking about time. And I do think in the future that we are all have entered, like more and more trees are going to be under constant stress, are going to be deformed, are going to have injuries from weather events, and they're not going to be that classic child, like here's like one, trunk with beautiful symmetry. There might be more, I guess, trees that bear the marks of climate change in their morphology, in their shapes. And if we can kind of learn to appreciate, the kind of resilience that trees often show even after an injury. Again, I think there's a kind of aesthetics of these mediocre trees or dwarf trees. I mean, there's all these like problematic terms people use, but I just think of it as like a different kind of beauty that comes from time. Because like bristlecones in their very shape and form, they show time. I mean, you can not just see the rings, but you can see how thousands of years have produced this form. So it is like looking at long time. And again, like some ancient cities can have that same effect, or ancient buildings. And I just, I'm encouraged that like so many people have seen the beauty of these trees. I mean, we have to worry, like we all do, about people who cut things, take things, climb on trees, and damage their roots, looking for the perfect Instagram opportunity. But for the most part, I want to say, like, if more people are appreciating old trees, like I'm all for it.
Yeah. Well, you write in your book that climate stability promotes arboreal longevity, and that our recent geological past has created the ideal conditions for today's elderflora. Given what we know about future climate, is there any good news for the current old trees or for our relationship with them?
Is there any good news? I mean, okay. Again, if you take the long-term plant view, I mean, plants have been through lots of different planets on Earth, and there will always be winners and losers, evolutionary speaking. So, like, if you look at the Sierra Nevada, where the sequoias grow, I mean, it's heartbreaking news for humans who care about sequoias to see these crown fires, something never observed before. Like perhaps 20% of all mature specimens died in the last few years. I mean, that's just like, I don't think we've fully processed that. But will there still be a forest in Sierra Nevada? Of course. Will some species do better even as others decline? Like, yes, of course. And will it transition in the foothills to more of a chaparral community? Probably. That's good for chaparral. So I think there's a way you have to, it's not saying like, oh, well, it's, like we don't have to do anything because the earth will take care of itself. But I think there is like a certain amount of equanimity is a good thing to kind of balance despair, but also undue optimism. Like trees are not the answer. We can't plant enough trees to kind of, solve our problems. A lot of old trees will die. Trees we care about will die, but this will still be a planet full of plants because they have lived through so many worse things than we've thrown at the Earth so far. So there will be old trees in the future, but I think we do have to prepare for these heartbreaking losses, which means even more to kind of redouble our efforts to decarbonize, not for those old trees because, in a sense, it's too late for them. I mean, they've already like shown incredible resilience. It's more about the future oldest trees, and are we creating a future climate for them and the people who will care about them? And that's really the great project going forward. I mean, again, like in a site-specific way, like there's forest management practices, like in the Sierra Nevada, like prescribed fire is generally a good thing for the sequoias. So yeah, is there good news? I mean, like it's bad news for those lists. If you think of those lists of like, here are the oldest trees in the world, I mean, it's bad news, those trees, right? Because their climate is gone. But can there be future oldest trees in a low carbon or decarbonized world? Like, yeah, of course. And so that's the hopeful thing, if you can sort of think forward enough. And like, how do we get there, and how do we make sure that people of the future have a world with chronodiversity?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Your penultimate chapter is Time to Mourn, but I agree with you that the overall tone of the book is anti-hopeless, which is a good way to put it, rather than hopeful. I want a chance to get to some of the questions that were submitted in advance from our audience. This is a good question. Do we see a difference between one old tree versus old growth forests? Or how does a particular tree qualify as special?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is the book primarily about trees, not forests, though in the latter chapters there's a little slippage. But I'm not a forest historian in this book. I'm a tree historian. And I actually am fascinated why people care so much about individual trees. And that, to me, this is one of the great paradoxes of our relationship with fellow life forms is that, we as a species, but then, if you just think about like my inheritance, European colonists are my people in a sense, right? Jared Farmer, my farmer ancestors came from England in the 19th century. Like Americans of European extraction just destroyed so many forests, and that's just not an American story. In New Zealand and Australia, many other places, it's just like unbelievable. But if you go in earlier periods in China, there's incredible deforestation and an earlier time period for different reasons. So like humans just destroy trees, and yet humans love trees, revere trees, worship trees, care for trees, have these enduring traditions. And that's just this deep, deep paradox that I think we just need to sit with and kind of realize that, we need to like maybe learn to revere at the same scale that we learn to destroy, or some people learn to destroy in the industrial period. Like, can we scale up that kind of old tradition of caring and revering? That's one way of kind of getting at this issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can focus too much on an individual tree, of course, right? And no tree is an individual, right? Trees are modular organisms that live within microbial communities, and of course, many trees like rely on pollinators, not the conifers, but so this whole idea of individuals is very problematic for anything, including humans, actually, but especially trees. And so in a sense, this book is kind of working with this personification fallacy that there is such a thing as a tree, like this individual plant that has some correlation with humans, like it has a body, has a trunk, it has arms, it has limbs, it has sort of honorary personhood. I mean, that's a total fallacy. That's like trees don't live that way, but then that helps us revere them. So like, I don't want to throw it away, but I think there is a way that gradually we need to work towards a kind of appreciation, or even like, again, a sense of reverence around these organisms that are not just modular, but often like clonal, but in addition to that are in these deep symbiotic relationships with fungi. They're effectively like superorganisms, and maybe we are too, if you think about all of the bacteria and microbes inside of us that make us, and sometimes maybe even compel us in ways we don't understand, that we are two very different types of like superorganisms that are affiliating. And I think there's going to be, maybe I won't live to see it, but there might be in the future when we understand ourselves better as not individuals, but as part of these communities on all kinds of scales, from like cellular to microbial to like social. We are interacting, affiliating with plants that are similarly complicated, but in a different way, and there will be a different vocabulary needed for that moment. And I kind of look forward to that, even though I may not live to see it. So this book is very much, I'm a historian. I'm sort of like stuck with ideas and words from the past, and then I try to invent words that will take us a little bit into the future. But I do think someday there'll be like even newer words to kind of express a newer understanding. When we get beyond this idea of like individual versus group.
Well, based on what you just said about needing more and more stories that tell us much richer understanding about trees and relationships, and not the kind of caricature or personification, maybe brings us to another audience question, which is why so much interest in trees right now? There's been a lot of publications lately.
I want to say I just missed like the peak tree moment. I think I was kind of like, if it weren't for COVID, I might have like got right at the end of peak tree. So I mean, like there was Peter Laban, German forester, had a series of best-selling books. Richard Powers won the Pulitzer with the Overstory. Suzanne Simard, great forest ecologist, had the book The Mother Tree. I think those are the three most prominent authors in that kind of tree moment that we recently went through. But why? And my book's part of it too, of course, and it's in conversation with it. I didn't write this book knowing that we're in a tree moment. I just sort of, I guess we are. And then I didn't quite realize it, and no doubt I was influenced by it. So like, and it sort of caused me to reflect on my own endeavors. I think it has a lot to do with that metaphor of the World Wide Web and the Wood Wide Web, the other web. This, that Peter Voleben and Suzanne Simard have popularized this idea that like trees are within forests are like networked, right? And an old tree or a mother tree is like a central node in a kind of like system that can share and communicate. And so it became, again, I think there's sometimes a personification fallacy built into that kind of description of ecology, but nonetheless, I think that's why people like responded to it, because it is a personification. And I think they responded in part because it provided an alternative to our actual experience of the web. Because I remember when the web was brand new.
I do too.
And I remember the world before the web. And I want to say that even though as a researcher I appreciate it every day, I don't think it's made me happier. I don't think it's made most people, I think it's made most people I know unhappier, especially in the kind of post-social media, when we've become even more networked socially, but then we feel, on the other hand, like we're alienated and angry and disconnected, and you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like the opposite of what we thought. So there's this idea that, oh, well, maybe there's this alternative model where like trees are networked, but it's altruistic, they're sharing, it's almost like this utopian like vision of like a different WWW, the Wood Wide Web. Whether or not that's actually like what trees are doing is maybe beside the point, right? Because trees are things we think through, and I mean trees are worthy of our deepest thoughts. So like I'm not like dismissing this. I just want to say that I think there's a personification fallacy in it, but I think maybe that's okay to some level, as long as you don't believe that trees are actually talking to each other, because trees don't talk.
Yeah.
And trees probably
communicate.
Trees aren't like, mothers and fathers, and they don't maybe, share the way that we would share. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be inspired by them, or to kind of like use trees to re-examine our own networks and say like, are they functioning the way we want them to function, right? To the extent that they inspire a different kind of like political and social thinking, that's like, I'm all for it. But I guess I need to stress, because people often ask, and like, if a tree could speak, Jared, like what would they say? Like they don't speak. And actually, like this book, again, I don't even know what a tree is in the end, even though this book is about trees. But I'm working with the cultural material I have. But like where this book led me is to this very different way of thinking about trees, where like they are so alien. They're like aliens on Earth. They're alien, but then I can feel about them, and I can feel a deeper time, and that is such a gift. So that's kind of where I ended up with this book, a place I didn't expect to be.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our conversation. We're unfortunately out of time. Yeah. Jared, thank you so much for sharing some of the highlights and background of your book, Elderflora.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll all register for the next virtual Lightbulb Café, which will feature Brent Siebel, who's an assistant professor of history, and he will be speaking about his most recent book, Illusions of Progress, Business, Poverty, and Liberalism in the American Century. Please check out the Penn Arts and Sciences website or follow us on social media for more information about this event, as well as others, and please enjoy the rest of your day.